All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome. Today we are going to talk a little bit about variables and setting up an experiment. Our goal is to talk about independent variable, dependent variables, to talk about constants, talk about control group, and we're going to talk a little bit about setting up a data table when you do set up an experiment, how to properly set that up. All right. Before we get started, though, talking about the things we're going to talk about here today, this is our first time taking notes using this remote asynchronous version. So you need to have out your notebooks. You're not just watching this, all right? You need to be active in what you're doing and active as part of your learning, all right? I have a pretty good memory, but you don't remember everything, especially after a long day of doing 7 periods of something. So get out your notebooks. I'll pause to wait. I'll pause to let you do that. Okay, now I want you to have your guys' notebooks out. Couple things. We're going to talk about a little experiment here. We're going to talk about different parts of it. At home, when you are taking your notes on this stuff, don't think just because I wrote it on the board, you automatically write it. But more importantly, if I don't write it, you don't have to write it. That's not the case. All right? I'm not going to write every single definition. I will talk about them. But then that is your responsibility. Your responsibility as a note taker and as a learner is to notate that or to annotate that. So if I say, write independent variable, and then I stand over here and define it, as a note taker, your job is if you look at it later and you just see the word independent variable, that doesn't help you. You need to make sure you're active about it and you actually write down what it is I say about the independent variable. The beautiful thing about this video here is that you guys could just pause me at any point. You can go back and watch it again like, oh, I didn't hear what he said. This first time doing this, I will drop a couple hints and help us practice about, oh, he said something, I should write that down. I'm going to help you a little bit, but the idea going forward is that you get more and more self-sufficient in those things. All right? So today I'll kind of help you walk through it a little bit and say, like, you should have wrote that down or take a moment and write that down. Even if I don't write on the board, if you feel like it's valuable, you need to write it down. And I would say when note-taking, don't trust your memory. All right? Don't trust that you are going to remember that. That's where most people fail, is they think, well, I have a pretty good memory, so I'll remember what he said there. There's a lot of things that happen in your life, so the odds are you won't. So make sure you're writing these things down on your own. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Make sure you're all set, your paper, pencil. I'll even pause for a second to kind of let you get the setup going here. I'm going to write kind of over here, and stuff like that. So give you a second. You can pause it right now if you need to. I'll pause it myself. Okay. All right. So once we're ready, so we have a problem here we're trying to solve, or we're trying to figure out, and we're going to use experimentation. We're going to collect data to be able to answer this question, or at least give us a direction where we're going. All right. Does the amount of coffee affect test scores? So does the amount of coffee I drink in the morning affect how well I'm going to perform on, let's say, my math test here? All right. So first thing, when I look at this question here, there's basically the setup here. I see that there are two things that I'm testing. All right. There are two things I'm trying to see. I'm trying to see a cause and effect. How does A affect B? Or in this case, how does the amount of coffee affect test scores? So whatever experiment I end up doing on this, I'm going to be changing the amount of coffee I drink. And I'm going to be changing, ideally, because of that, the test scores are going to change. Those are the two things that are going to change in this experiment. That makes these two things here called variables. Right? So there's our first word here. Right. A variable is anything that changes during an experimentation. It's what you are directly testing. This is that hint. This is where you would write this part down, all right? Because I'm not writing the definition, right? But I need you to write it down. A variable is anything that changes in an experimentation. It's what you are testing. Pause it if you need to do this. All right, so I have two variables here. All right, I have, in this experiment here, I have two things changing. I have the amount of coffee that is changing, and I'm going to have the test scores that are changing. So those are two things that are changing. But in an experiment, we only want two things to change. We always want two variables and I'm going to change one of them and see how it affects the other one. How does A affect B? Cause and effect. All right. So there are two types of variables out there. There's the independent variable and the dependent variable. All right. There's a lot of ways to remember this. Some like it just the good old-fashioned way that the dependent variable is dependent on the independent. I like to think of it as the word independent begins with the letter I. Right? It is the variable that if I was running this experiment, it is the variable that I am changing or I am causing. Right? And not changing test scores. What I'm changing is the amount of coffee I'm drinking. Right? I'm choosing that. That makes this the independent variable. Right? That's my independent variable. All right? My independent variable is the variable that I change, I choose. All right? I cause, and the result of that is the dependent variable. All right? Some people even like to think of it as backwards. All right? What is the end goal that I'm getting? The test scores. What am I doing to change those test scores? I'm drinking the coffee. All right? But in this case here, my dependent variable is going to be my test scores. It relies on how much coffee I drink. All right? So that's my two variables here. I have my independent variable and my dependent variable. All right? Now, one thing I notice is the amount of coffee that I'm testing. I am not testing different types of coffee. In this case here, I set this up here where I'm drinking 100 milliliters of coffee and I'm drinking 200 milliliters of coffee. That's different amounts. Right? Everything else in the experiment that's not the amount of coffee or the test scores should stay the same. All right? Should stay the same. And anything that stays the same in an experiment is what we call a constant. A constant is what stays the same in the experiment. This is where you write this down. Pause it if you need to. I'll say it again. A constant is anything that stays the same in an experiment. Right? It's what we need to do. It's something we're not testing. I'm not testing an English. How does the amount of coffee test my English score versus my math score? Right? Ideally, not only do we want to have the same test, right? We want to have the same test. Just some example. Same coffee. Right, same type of coffee. We want to have the same difficulty of the test. This list could go on forever because it should include everything except the amount of coffee should be different for each group. And ideally, the test scores will be different. Sometimes they'll be the same, but they could be changing. So, I have two variables that are changing. Everything else is a constant. I could literally be where the math test is taken, what time of day, the same student taking the test, or the same level of student. All right? You have to think about the student taking the test. All right? If you have someone who is very, very good at math, and then someone who has a very big challenge at math, your scores you're not testing coffee then. You're testing not only coffee, math skill, and how that affects the test score. You don't want to test multiple things. You just want to test one thing at a time. How it affects the test scores. All right? So we have our variables, we have our constants, we're ready to collect our data. All right? Now let's say, let's see, how do we want to do this? Let's say we collect our data. All right? We do this, and with the 100, you get a 60%. Right? And when you drink the more coffee, you get a 75%. That's hard. All right? Hey, you did better. Right? More coffee. The conclusion would be, more coffee you drink, better you do. Right? So, with that said, I should just always have more coffee. There's a problem. All right? This is still missing one thing. All right? Is having coffee good at all? All right? In an experiment, if we try and compare it to kind of a natural state, if you will, something that if that independent variable doesn't or isn't included. So we need to actually include one more thing here. All right, I need to include one more group. So I'm going to draw another math test. All right, this one would take the same test, same coffee, same difficulty of test, same subject, same student, but this time this one is going to be what we call our control group. All right. Our control group is any group that does not get the independent variable. Any group that does not get the independent variable. All right. So in this case here, the independent variable, we should always try and control or have a control group if possible. All right. The control group is the amount of coffee. Well, having no independent variable would mean that this group here has no coffee, or 0 milliliters of coffee. If I have 0 milliliters of coffee, and let's say that group there, that student takes at that time and with no coffee, and they score a 85%. Okay, so our original conclusion was that the more coffee you have, the better you are. But with the control group, I could see that, sorry, there's the school bell. I see that actually having coffee at all is actually worse than having no coffee. So we have our control group. Now this is what the students get really stuck on a lot, is the idea of what's a control. And you have to think about it. What is control group means? No independent variables. So if you know what the independent variables, think about, is there any situation of these three here that does not have that coffee? That is your control group. All right. So let's say we're ready to, when we collect data on this, we need to create a data table. So we're going to be setting up experiments this year. We're going to be identifying the variables, setting it up. Sometimes we'll have a control group. Sometimes you can't. It just sets up on the experiment. All right. You're going to have lots of constants. You're going to have your two variables. You're going to have you need to record this data in a data table. All right. And there is actually some structure to actually doing this. Most people just end up just drawing kind of like numbers everywhere, and that is not an effective way to record your data. If you make a good data table, your actually graphing should be very, very easy because you've set it up already. All right. So in this case here, if I was going to set up my data table, all right, I would have a data table. I always just like to start with it. Graph paper. You can make a nice grid. All right. We got a nice little basically T-chart here of my data. All right. Probably doesn't even need to be that big. All right. It's actually quite simple. They say, well, which one goes here and which one goes here? If you set this data table up right, all right, you will have you'll make graphing so much easier. So here's our data table. All right. Your independent variable is the one that you picked ahead of time. So I literally already knew that I wanted to do this as 0 milliliters, 100 milliliters, and 200 milliliters. Your independent variable goes in this first one here. Your independent variable always goes in the left column. So here's my amount of coffee. Which means my dependent variable is going to be on my right column here. That's going to be the data that we're recording. If you're not sure which one's your independent, dependent variable, you're not sure, but you already made your data table, that should tell you. Whatever you put on the left is your independent. And whatever you put on the right is your dependent. I should be able to look at a data table and immediately know which one's your independent, dependent, because the one that you put that has incremental measurements, this one it goes up by 100 milliliters, is your independent. And you were trying to see how does this affect this. So this would be test scores. right? So at 0, I had 85%, 100, I had 60%, and with 200 milliliters, it was 75%. All right, so there's our data table. And from a data table, I can start to make a graph, which we'll do in a different video. We'll talk a little bit about how to properly convert this data table. So, recapping. All right, we have a problem. If I'm testing things, I can only test 2 things against each other. If I start testing more things, we don't know which one's affecting which. If I was testing different types of coffee and different amounts of coffee on the test board, and I did better or worse, was it the type of coffee or was it the amount of coffee that made the difference? So you only can do 2 at a time. The one that you choose or I cause is called the independent, and the one that results from that is called the dependent. Everything else should stay the same. Those are what we call constants. And there should be one group that doesn't receive any of the independent variable. That's called the control group. Once we collect it, the independent variable goes in the left column, the dependent variable goes in the right column, and from there we can make a proper graph. All right. Now, this is obviously just about coffee and test scores, but this same principle can be applied to lots of different examples, which I'm going to ask you guys to do. All right. If you don't feel like you got all the notes in here, remember, I didn't write every definition. If you look back at those notes and I don't know what that is, but he did talk about it, go back in the video, find where I talked about it, and write it down. Pause it and write it down. When it's like, I still don't understand control, go back, listen to that part again. This isn't just about completion. This is your education, so you need to make sure you're fulfilling all of it. All right? And we will go on more with that later. So, you can always message me if you have any questions. Otherwise, thank you for listening and thank you for watching. And good luck, and may the science be with you.